Now, folks, I've thought long and hard about who I am and what my skills are, and I figured I've got a little Howard Cosell in me, a little Pat Sajak, and of course, a little P.T. Barnum. One thing I don't have in me is Donald Trump, and I apologize for the thin crowd. I tried to reason it away as the weather, but then I thought again, it's August outside. I thought about the advertising and the coup about tickets might not be sold at the door. People interpreted that as sold out. And finally, of course, with this horrible economy, the price of $16 is out of reach, unfortunately, for a lot of people. So this will be on YouTube. That's the good news or bad news, depending upon what your web presence is. Before we go to our next speaker, I would like to talk about a fire that I've researched that took place in one of the great Grand Islands off of the coast of Massachusetts in the year 1846. In that year, Nantucket was suffering and on the decline. It had been surpassed as the #1 whaling community in America by New Bedford. There were 75 whaling vessels in Nantucket in 1820. By 1846, there were only a dozen. And to compound things, there was a sandbar that was blocking off Nantucket Harbor. And on a hot, moonlit July night, a windy, balmy night in July, Nantucket caught on fire. And I want to go over some of the details. First of all, it was the first major fire in Nantucket since 1838. Nantucket suffering some major fires at Sandy Point Lighthouse. It began on Main Street in a hat shop owned by Mr. William Geary in a stovepipe that had left overnight. And this fire began at 11 o'clock in the evening and burned right through until the morning. And one of the problems was that they had two competing fire brigades, volunteer fire brigades, who actually got into a shoving match over who had the right to the water cistern. And had they settled that up front, this thing would have been doused and put out right away. But unfortunately, due to the wind, it got out of control. Barrels of whale oil exploded and burning oil flowed into the water, creating what one man described as a sea of fire. There were 7 hours later, most of the town's commercial area lay in ashes. It consumed 250 buildings, almost all of the markets and shops, 7 factories that processed whale oil, 12 warehouses, and 8 of the town's wharves, and many, many homes. It ended Nantucket's reign as the whaling capital of the world, and by 1848, in January of 1848, gold had been discovered in California at Sutter's Mill, and many of the young men left the island in search of gold. So from 9,700 people down to a little under 8,000 after 1848, Nantucket would go from a whaling community, a fishing community, to a community that is known as today, a community of artisans. But they said, the incredible thing that I found is that it said that the glow could be seen from Boston, Massachusetts about this fire. And I thought that it's an incredible fire, the Great Nantucket Fire of 1846. And the reason why I wanted to preface this particular segue vignette with our next speaker, she produced a book that changed my life. And it's called Boston on Fire. And it's a desert island book for me. If you say you can only take 10 with you to an island, one of these books, her book, Boston on Fire, would certainly come with me. She was a features editor for the Boston Herald for 12 years until she struck out on her own as a freelance writer in 2005. Her articles regularly appear in the Boston Globe, the Harvard Gazette, MIT's Tech Talk, and other publications. She writes 2 columns for the Boston Globe's Sidekick section and often contributes music reviews, celebrity interviews, and other features like travel pieces. She's leaving for Africa tomorrow. She also writes the behind-the-scenes feature for the Globe Northwest. She's the author of some great books, including the one that she'll be speaking about tonight, called The Crime of the Century, How the Brinks Robbers Stole Millions and the Hearts of Boston, which was published in February of this year by Commonwealth Editions. She's got a great book that will go into reprint on the Boston Harbor Islands entitled East of Boston, Notes from the Harbor Islands, which was published in July of this year by the History Press. And in fact, as an aside, when she gets back from her trip to Africa, we're going to talk about pulling together some sort of tour of the Boston Harbor Islands. So if you're interested in that and you have my email address, let me know and we'll get something together this summer. Her other books include Boston on Fire, A History of Fires and Firefighting in Boston, and she's considered right now one of the foremost authorities on the Coconut Grove fire tragedy. She's also the editor of Boston's Fire Trail, a walk through the city's fire and firefighting history, published last year in 2007. She's contributed research and copy to Great New England Storms of the 20th Century. You can see how all of her work weaves, and I have an interest in all the things that she writes about. She's also worked for the Boston office of the Associated Press, the Taft newspaper chain, and newspapers in Missouri, Utah, and Connecticut. It is my pleasure, nay, it is my honor to introduce to you Stephanie Schorow.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, John, for that marvelous introduction. Thank you, and it's so exciting to be here to talk about history. I mean, just think about it. We're going from patriots to fires to wise guys. I mean, isn't history wonderful? And so what I'm going to do, as soon as we get this, it's on, so. Took a while to get, oh. We'll get it sooner or later. Well, let me, while they're playing with the technology on it, just make sure, is it plugged in here? I'll just start and tell you that a lot of people start by asking me about how I got interested in the Brinks robbery. But let me do a little quick poll. How many people here have actually heard of the Brinks robbery? How many people know? Okay, how many people have not heard of the Brinks robbery? Okay, very good. Oh, a few people, excellent. So, and how many people are here because you want to find out where the money is? Okay, all right. We'll get to that towards the end of the thing. So, the reason I was interested in the Brinks robbery, and I got in the spirit of things by wearing my little wise guy hat, incidentally, was I had heard about it as well. I'm not from Boston, but I love Boston history, and I've heard a lot of stories about Boston. And I'd always heard about the Brinks robbery. I knew it was one of the biggest robberies in history. It had a major impact in Boston, but you didn't hear much about it. I kind of knew where it had happened. And then I covered a story from the Herald, which was about the opening of a new hotel in a police headquarters, and I met a woman who was the archivist for the Boston Police Department. And she told me that there were boxes and boxes of archival material about the Brinks robbery in the police headquarters. And I thought, wow, this is cool. The money could even be in there. So I started my research. I looked and found out that nothing had been written about the Brinks robbery since the 1970s. And surprisingly, for a crime that happened in the 1950s, a lot of follow-up, a lot of things had happened since that time. So that's how I got started. I gave them enough time. Let's see. We had it going before, so. There we go. Excellent. All right, here we go. Oh, no. Don't put down my Mac. Okay, anyway, let's get started. So what was the Brinks robbery? First of all, you have to know about what Brinks was. Brinks was a money-moving company. And here's one of their armored cars or trucks. They're still around today. You see Brinks trucks in Boston, still going around. One thing I should remind you about that time is that it was a cash society. People ask me today if we could have a robbery like the Brinks, and probably not, because we now deal on computers, on wire transfers. But in those days, in the 1950s, money was transferred, cash money was transferred. And the Brinks Company had a very lucrative business transferring payrolls. Because in those days, when you got paid, you didn't get a check, you got the cash in a little envelope that the company would actually bring to the factory or to the office where you're working and actually go around and hand it out. So they were moving huge amounts of money, and the Brinks Company had this ferocious reputation for being secure, very professional, and if you had your money with Brinks, you could be very secure about it. So in those days, The Brinks had a garage and a headquarters, if you will, in Boston, in this building. This is a recent picture. The building's still here. This is the North Terminal Garage. This is Commercial Street, and that's Prince Street that goes up there. That's how it looks now. This is how it looked in 1950. This is Commercial Street. There was an elevated train there now. And here we're looking up Prince Street. This was taken right after the robbery. And you can see that the building really doesn't look that much different today. And that's, if I could throw that in about doing history in Boston, one of the best things about doing research in Boston is you can walk around the city and see where things happened and really get a feeling for it. And I spent a fair amount of time when I was researching this, walking around this area, walking through the North End. So here we are. Okay, let me set the stage. It's January 17th, 1950, and now we're looking right into the Brinks headquarters, which was on the second floor of that garage that I showed you. This would have been around 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and the men in the Brinks were putting the money away for the day. A lot of money was coming in because a lot of money would be going out in the morning to all the paychecks. So they'd be sorting money, they'd be getting ready to pack everything into this vault right here. So they sort it all out, and then about 7 o'clock put all the money in the office into this vault and lock it up for the evening, and then they would go home. So the idea was that even though money was stored there overnight, it was in a very, very secure vault that was connected to an alarm system. So they were busy doing their job when, without warning, they heard a noise, and suddenly there were 5 or 7 or 6, they couldn't be quite sure, men with guns inside the Brinks building, up on the second floor. How did they get in there? Telling them, pull anything, do as you're told, and you won't get hurt, but we're taking the money, or something to that effect. This is an artist's conception about it. The men all, there were several details about this. The men all looked alike to the guards because they were, first of all, wearing these full masks that went right over the head and covered them up. These masks were later identified as being Captain Marvel and Captain Marvel Jr. But at the time, they seemed very scary. The men were the men were also wearing Army or Navy pea coats that made them look alike, and plus they had chauffeurs' caps on. We'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So they startled the men, and the men felt they had no choice but to let them in because they were behind. There was actually one locked door here that the men were on the other side of this grill here. They let them in because they felt that they would start shooting if they didn't. The guards were tied up. Their glasses were taken off, which is a kind of a key thing because it was hard for them to identify the men. And the robbers proceeded to take money from the vault, which was still open, and take it out in huge barrels and very, very quickly out of the office there. It took about 20 minutes. There was one interruption. I won't go into detail. There's a lot of details about this crime that I just won't have time for. But the upshot is in about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, the men had pulled literally millions of dollars out of the Brinks office, took off. One of the guards managed to get free, hit an alarm, and the police were there. And this is a crime scene photo of the police on the scene of the Brinks. You can see the vault there. It's missing one thing. And this is a picture of a reporter who was actually there, a guy named Ed Corsetti, who I interviewed for the story. And he was there that night. He came in, he managed to get up in there. And what he's showing me is how thick the money was on the floor of the garage. The money was so thick that they were literally wading through it. And he took one look at this and ran back and told his editor, this is probably the biggest robbery in history because this is what they left behind. Can you imagine what they took? So indeed, it was considered the biggest robbery in the American history. This figure, this is what they initially thought it was. And you know, they say leave another million there. 9 bandits. Actually, I'll jump ahead. There were 11, but at the time they thought there might have been 9. People in Boston woke up to or heard on the radio about this crime, which made headlines all over the world. The world was fascinated by it for several reasons. One, the guards who were tied up were not hurt. They were not hurt at all. They were roughed up, but it was a very smooth operation. And two, the robbers hit Brinks. Now, what was Brinks? It was a big company. It wasn't the church. It wasn't a family. They could afford it. So went the thought about it. So people began to take a very perverse pride in it. In fact, people in Boston thought it was pretty smart that the guys got away with it. They left very few clues behind. One was the rope that they used to tie up the tie up the guards. And another was one chauffeur's cap that was left there. And many people thought this was a major clue. They must have left it there for a reason. It was a sign of something. And in the initial reports about the robbery, many people looked at the fact that one cap was left there and said, aha, it has to mean something, as if this were an Agatha Christie novel that they were reading and not a real crime report. So how much was actually stolen? Well, there was these are the figures from the FBI. There's a lot of figures that kicked around on this, but this is what the FBI determined. It was about $1.2 million in cash, about $1.5 more in securities checks that could not actually be negotiated. The cash today would be about $10 million. This was a lot of money. The money couldn't be traced except for $100,000. They knew the serial numbers of $100,000 of that huge amount of money that went out. And these figures here were publicized all over Boston. Newspapers ran them. And so people were going over and looking in their billfolds and saying, let me see that bill and let me compare it to the serial numbers here. In fact, one reporter actually went to a racetrack and exchanged huge amounts of money and just compared the serial numbers because racetracks were a good place to launder money. So he thought he might be able to track the money that way. But this was never found, at least not right away. So as the weeks went on and the investigation got started, a lot of people thought this was very funny, that there was so much money that probably the robbers didn't even know what to do with it. First of all, they could barely count it. And then there was the speculation that it had to be an inside job, that nobody could have gotten away from this unless they had help from somebody within the Brinks operation. And indeed, some people felt that nobody in Boston was smart enough. Check this name, Joe Dineen. He was a reporter for the Boston Globe, and he wrote. We'll meet him again, but he wrote a number of stories about the Brinks. In fact, he had this notebook. He continually wrote about it. But there was a lot of speculation that the robbers must have been from New York, that they came over because nobody in Boston was really smart enough to pull it off. Another thing that happened is that the Brinks company itself offered a $100,000 reward for the return of the bandits, return of the money as well, but they would prefer to have the bandits more dead than alive. And this did not actually sit well because a lot of people in Boston were starting to root for the bandits. But the large reward and a number of news stories about this robbery began to bring in piles and piles of letters, tips, suggestions from all over the world that came to the Boston Police Department about the robbery. You can't read these, I'm sorry, but they're a little bit blurry, but I can tell you this one's from Japan. Many of these letters have been preserved. They're part of that archive in the Boston Police Department that I talked about, and I went through them, and it was a real snapshot into the minds of the public at that time, who each tried to fit their own particular theory into who were these amazing bandits who got inside the Brinks office and then took off with this money. This one, you can't read it, but it's one of my favorites. This person has this very elaborate theory that It was communist agents. And in fact, a lot of people thought it had to be communist. And what these communist agents did is that they got the money out of the Brinks into a truck. They drove the truck to the Mystic River. A submarine came up. They unloaded the money into the submarine. The submarine took off to Mother Russia. And the truck, now empty, was above suspicion. But I will point out that you'll notice this is very well typed out with a heading. This is not this is someone who really thought about the problem. There were some tips like this, like, here is a break for you on the Brinks, but remember my initials as I will want part of the reward. Get a hold of a blonde that lives at 5 Roy Street, Brighton, first floor. I think her name is Daniels. She will lead you to them if you watch her closely. So there were many tips like that. Now, one thing that was noticeable about that most of these tips were from people who really didn't have a lot of knowledge inside Boston's underground. And there was quite a criminal element in Boston at this time, as you might guess. The police, in fact, were baffled at the fact that they were not getting the help from other criminals the way they often get in these kind of cases. A lot of criminals will, for the right amount of money, turn on another person, give up a tip, but there was a surprising lack of cooperation. And this was a problem for police. Now, there is a mythology about the Brinks robbery that everybody in Boston knew who had done it right away. I mean, I ran into people who would say, oh yeah, we knew who did it right away. You know, they knew it, they figured it out. I don't think that's true. I think that, yes, in about 2 to 3 months, the FBI and the police did have a pretty good idea on who was involved, because they knew a lot of the criminals around the area, and they knew that these particular gentlemen must have been involved. But they couldn't put it all together. They couldn't put out how they actually pulled it off. They knew that some people were involved, but they didn't really understand how they could have pulled it off, especially getting into the Brinks building. So basically, the tips fizzled. So who were these masterminds? I mean, they were considered that they had pulled off the crime of the century, and who were they? So let me jump ahead in the story and introduce you to them. Here they are. Here's our friends, the Brinks gang. Tony Pino is, in my mind, the mastermind of the Brinks. He's from Boston. He grew up in South Boston. This is his brother-in-law, Vinny Costa. And these are other members of his gang, people he used to work with. You might recognize this gentleman right here, Specs O'Keefe, who plays a major role in it. Joe McGinnis, who was a barkeeper in Eggleston Square. Henry Baker, who was a safecracker. He joined the gang pretty late. Jazz Maffey plays a major role. He was a bookmaker, well-known, very handsome, was considered above suspicion. Although he would place bets for people, he wasn't considered a criminal type. And then the driver of the getaway car, Barney Bainfield, who was actually from Charlestown. And I thought it was always fun because when I gave a talk in Charlestown and I was going through all this, I got to, and here's the Charlestown resident. Everyone applauded. Yeah, there's a book. So what happened is, to make a long story short, because it's actually quite complicated, Tony Pino was a well-known criminal, and he was a master safe cracker. He knew how to break into almost every safe. And he got obsessed with the Brinks. He managed to rob some of the Brinks trucks that went around. And then he realized that those trucks had money, but the office had the most money. So he came up with the plan to get into the Brinks building and go in just before the vault was closed, because once that vault was closed and all the money was in there, you could not get into the vault without basically blowing it up. So his plan was to get in with a show of force just before the vault door would be closed, scare the guards, and get out of there as quick as they could. And he was able to figure out the exact operations of the Brinks by observing the operation from the neighborhood. And I'll show you how he did that in a few minutes. But basically, Tony put this together. He brought on Joe McGinnis, who was going to be the man who laundered the money, and then he brought on these other people who each were to play a key role in putting the whole thing together. But how were they caught? Well, after the robbery, the robbers split up the money, and they got approximately $100,000 each, more or less. There's some speculation about if some got a little more than others, but we think that they each got about $100,000 of the cash that could not be traced and that was negotiable, that you could just use it. Each robber took his share and then was told to lay low, be quiet, don't spend it around, just act cool. There was no pact, as far as I can tell, to not spend the money until the statute of limitations had turned out. This is a mythology that's been promoted by the movie The Brinks Job. I don't believe that's true. I don't think they would have been that sophisticated, but there was a pact to keep quiet.